Hi, this is Mary with Insect Shield, and I'm super happy to have Dr. Ross Boyce with me here today. He is a professor at the University of North Carolina Medical School, specializing in the division of infectious disease. Welcome, Dr. Boyce.
Thanks for having me.
First, if you could just give us an introduction, tell us about yourself.
Sure. I grew up outside Winston-Salem, which I know is not too far from Insect Shield, but I ended up
Yeah.
doing my after some time in the Army. I went into the medical field and did my medical school here at UNC, and then went up to Boston to do my internal medicine residency training before coming back down here to set up shop. During that time, I started working mostly in Uganda around malaria in the western and rural parts of that country where malaria is a big problem. And I've been working there now for the past 10 years on trying to control and prevent malaria in that rural area.
Okay, wow. So there's a lot there. I know we've worked with you at Insect Shield with tick-borne disease, so malaria is more, that's your specialty, but you kind of work in all the different vector-borne disease.
I do. Yeah, I mean, we are fortunate to have malaria here in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when I'm here, a lot of the principles are the same. And so I certainly focus on tick-borne diseases here in North Carolina as well.
Gotcha. So really, we wanted today to concentrate on malaria because coming up Thursday is World Malaria Day. So I think, obviously a lot of talk comes back to malaria. As you mentioned, in the US, we don't worry about malaria very much unless maybe we're going, only if we're maybe going abroad for travel or for work. And one thing I was reading that half of the global population is at risk for malaria. So really, everyone should be concerned about malaria.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the map of malaria pretty much covers most of the middle of the earth, for lack of a better way of looking at it. The tropics, whether you're in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and Caribbean as well. And as we've seen, as the climate's changing a little bit, even some recurrence down in Florida and our southern border this past year.
Yeah, yes, we saw that. So I guess that is the question of kind of like what's the state of malaria in 2024? I just, why I started working with Insect Shield back in, it's kind of 2003, 2007. We would talk a lot about malaria, but then in the US, as more tick-borne disease came about, that kind of became our topic because we can obviously help a lot of folks here. But it feels a little bit like, I don't know, maybe not in your world, but it's like malaria has now it's not getting quite the attention that maybe it got for a while. I know every once in the you hear, in the news it pops up, oh, there's a vaccine potentially coming. The Gates Foundation obviously doing a lot of work. What do you kind of in your last, years working in the malaria? What do you see as like the state of malaria right now?
Yeah, I think maybe in the early 2000s and even into the teens, there was a lot of excitement with investment in malaria happening, and we were rolling out bed nets and some new treatments were coming online. And I think there was a lot of optimism, which fed investment, which fed more interventions, which fed good outcomes, which, it's sort of a virtuous cycle there. I wish I could say that kept happening. So we started to see some trends, one of which was more and more mosquitoes that showed resistance to some of the things that were being used, whether it was the insecticide in the bed nets. We saw mosquitoes start to get smart, I guess would be one way, and that they've changed how they feed. So traditionally, the mosquitoes would rest in the house and wait for you to go to bed and then bite you while you're asleep. But with nets being so common, it seems they've evolved to learn to bite early in the morning when you first come out of the house, or early in the evening before you go to bed. So some of those interventions that used to be key to how we prevented malaria just don't work like they used to. And then, of course, there's been sort of this not wholly unexpected, but perhaps faster than we thought, development of resistance to some of the treatments that we use that first started in Southeast Asia and is now spread to the African continent, which is certainly concerning. And so there's been some backsliding that's happened. And I think, that again, sort of negative or more negative perspective makes donors less excited to donate to the global sort of effort to reduce and eliminate malaria. And COVID happened, right? I mean, COVID made it harder to get nets out into the field. It made it harder for people to get into treatment. And so I would say, while things like the vaccines are exciting, they're far from perfect. And they still need a lot of work. There's a great sort of base to build upon. But in some of these other areas where we thought we'd achieved a lot, things are not quite looking as positive as they used to.
So if things were kind of maybe going on a slightly down, are you kind of coming back up to more cases kind of going back to levels that you'd seen before? Kind of all of those things were working?
Globally, maybe they haven't changed. They haven't changed as a top line number, but certainly in some of the worst places like Congo and where I work in Uganda, we've seen the numbers creep back up again, which is worrisome.
Yeah, so I'd love to just talk more about your work specifically, because it's something that, like we can hear an actual, concrete thing that's being done. So saw that you back in last September were awarded a 4.4 million 5-year grant to, and I'll quote this, evaluate the effectiveness of a chemo prevention effort designed to prevent malaria outbreaks after flooding. And you had to do a proof of concept to get that. So what does that all mean, and what have you done, and what are you going to do with all this money in this 5 years?
One of the things that we observed at our site is it's, for lack of a better term, it looks a lot like Western North Carolina. You've got hills and valleys. And with a changing climate, of course, you can't assign any single event to climate change, but we've seen more frequent and more severe flooding happening at our site. And when it floods, because of the heavy rainfall, you end up with infinite numbers of pools of standing water. And that is a vacation spot for the malaria mosquitoes. They love that. And that probably, the pathway for that to happen is that you get more mosquitoes laying eggs in those pools of water that are closer to households. More mosquitoes emerge, they bite more people. And so we tend to see this surge of malaria after these events. And one of the things that when this happened for the second time in 10 years, it's almost an annual event now, we said we just can't keep watching this happen. We studied it the first time. The second time we kind of said, let's do something. And so we got out into one of the villages where we work, and we gave the kids a medicine that's normally used to treat malaria, but it also has a really long half-life. And so because it sticks around in the body long enough, what it essentially does is it keeps those kids from getting malaria for anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. And so we gave them doses of this once a month for 3 months after the flooding, with the idea being maybe we can just bridge these kids through the worst of the malaria season that happens after the flooding. And if the mosquitoes can't establish those infections in the kids, maybe we can just keep that surge of malaria from happening. And we saw that happen in the pilot study. We saw drastic reductions in the amount of malaria compared to the villages where we didn't do that. And what was really, I think, striking was that we also saw malaria rates in people who did not get the treatment go down. And that's probably because there were just less parasites floating around in people for mosquitoes to pick up. So because the kids didn't have any, the mosquitoes in the villages might bite them, but they weren't picking up the parasites and then biting somebody else and transferring it. So there was a benefit even to those people who did not get the preventative treatment. And so now we got the funding from the NIH to do this on a much, much larger scale. So we'll be in 50 to 60 villages, probably something on the order of 35,000 people. And some of the villages will get this chemo prevention with this long-lasting medication after the next flood. And some will get the medication as well as a a larvicide, which of course is something you put in the water to kill any developing mosquitoes, to see if that does even better. So we're really excited to get that going, and I'm hoping, I mean, of course, we don't hope for flooding, but we're hoping that this next season will be when we roll it out, so probably next May.
And so will you be also targeting just the children, like is like kind of under a certain age that you'll be giving the chemo prevention medicine to?
Yeah, so we go for kids. The drug is a weight-based dose, and so there's a certain weight below which you can't give it. So not the youngest children, but up to about age 12 will receive it. And the reason we picked that is because, one, kids are the most impacted by malaria. So of all the deaths that happen, and there's about 400,000 a year globally, about 90 to 95% of those happen in kids under 5 in Africa, actually. And so that's certainly the most impacted group. But they're also the group that tends to harbor parasites the most. And so by targeting those kids with a drug that not only prevents infection, but also clears any existing infection, we're eliminating what we call the reservoir of parasites that's kind of sitting out there for mosquitoes to pick up if they're not already infected. So they're really a nice, it's the highest yield group. It just so happens that it is also the group that suffers the most from the disease.
Right. Yeah. And is there a theory behind why it's the kids? Is it just the immune system can't fight it that die, or is it just kind of economical? Are there many factors that go into it?
Yeah, it's a very complex sort of, I think immunity is one key part of it. So certainly if you or I were to get malaria, not having had it before or having had it multiple times, we'd get pretty sick. But adults who live in high incidence malaria areas get it, and they might feel tired or a little off, but they're not going to die because they've got pre-existing immunity. So it's children in these areas where there's a lot of malaria. They don't have the immunity built up. And so it's those early years where they're at risk. And then there's probably some period afterwards where even before they've built up enough immunity to control it or clear it out on their own. So it is very complex. And I think there's a lot of study that goes into it. But from sort of the who do we target population, it makes a lot of sense to go after children, just because what I talked about with the severe nature of the disease, as well as them holding on to parasites more than a lot of other groups.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting too to think that if protecting them then can protect everyone, because then there's not that the mosquito is not getting the parasite. So no, that's fascinating. And how have you found it in the villages you go to? Is the acceptance of you all coming in and doing this study? Are people happy to have you and to participate?
Yeah, having been at the site for 10 years and having strong local partners certainly goes a long way. Because this will be the largest study we've ever done, we'll be going into some new areas where we don't have sort of a pre-existing relationship and trust with the communities quite as much as we do in the area where we've worked. But for the most part, we get participation rates above 90%. And you would never get that here in the United States.
Yeah.
I think you do have to be careful with it, because obviously you don't want to incentivize people to do something that they wouldn't normally choose to do. But for the most part, everyone is very happy both to potentially receive some benefit from these interventions. And there's also a lot of pride knowing that these little rural villages are in some ways helping really advance our knowledge of sort of state-of-the-art science and how to prevent malaria. They do take a lot of pride in being a part of that.
Oh, that's wonderful. And then so the larvicide, is that something that in the community they'll be like putting something in the pools of water, or was that something like your team would do, or would answer that?
So we're actually going to use something called BTI, Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis. I probably didn't say that right, but it's It's a biological larvicide, and it's been around forever. It has a long use history with things like dengue. And if you were to go to Home Depot or Lowe's, you could probably find the little mosquito dunks or mosquito bricks. It's basically same formulation as that. We are going to do some basic teaching the first time to the residents, and then we will essentially hand it to them and say, do this every 2 weeks, just from a manpower perspective and thinking about treating every area around every home in 50 or 10,000 homes is beyond our capability, and ultimately we would want folks to do this for themselves anyway. And I think it just makes sense to push from that perspective instead of us coming in and trying to do it all ourselves. There's nothing terribly difficult about it. You could essentially eat it. It's not terribly toxic or unsafe or anything like that. And it really doesn't have any impact on mammals. So we think that just getting it out around the immediate house area is going to potentially be helpful.
And so this is hopefully when is this potentially going to start? When's the season?
So for the past 3 out of the last 5 years, there's been a severe flood in the middle to late May. Because we were funded in September. Yeah, well, I don't think we're going to get out this year because it does take some amount of time to get the organization set up and get our IRBs in place. So I think our goal is next May. But of course, there's no contracting with the weather. And so it may rain or it may not next May. So if it doesn't, we would defer to the following year. But we're set up. We ideally want to be ready to go next May. So that'd be May 2025. We'll be ready to intervene. But we do have to do some baseline work first.
Yeah. It's probably a lot to coordinate something like that. It's not, I mean, Philly got the grant in September. It's, not that many months ago. Now, do you go yearly to Uganda?
Yes, my wife and I both go. We actually met there. Strangely, she's a Texan, not a Ugandan, but we kind of alternate years. We have 3 children who are now 8, 7, and 5, so we don't go for extended periods, but we do kind of alternate years, and then we have a large team now of folks who go. We send students, PhD students, staff members back and forth. So it's we generally have someone there from the UNC side most of the time, and then of course we have a staff of about 20 on the Ugandan side, and we'll be getting even larger for this study.
Interesting. Well, I hope that'd be interesting to see what the results are of that, because it sounds like there's a lot of potential. So that's fantastic, and some new things happening. Because I think, like we said in the beginning, so I wasn't wrong in feeling like malaria is not as top of news as it was, 10, 15 years ago. I feel like there was so much talk. So hopefully things like this will kind of bring it back to the forefront and have people, supporting the efforts of folks like you. So I guess, I have two finishing questions. So number one, is there a myth about malaria that you feel like people believe that we could debunk here today?
I would actually maybe think that the myth is that it's a tropical disease in other places. And you can look back in journals and history books about malaria along the coast of North Carolina in the early 1900s and late 1800s. It wasn't that long ago that malaria was here and throughout the Southeast. And so I think keeping in mind not just the risk of it returning, we were able to eliminate it because, one, we had a really good treatment, which was DDT. It was good, effective for getting rid of the mosquitoes, perhaps not great for other things. And we didn't have really high transmission because it would get cleaned out by the winters every year. But with a changing climate and the way people are traveling, I think thinking that the risk is not just global, but there is a local risk as well is probably something that I think people should keep in mind and be conscious of. I don't want anyone to be scared, of course, but thinking that malaria is just something that happens over there is probably the myth, which is, an example of a great success of the past that we haven't really seen it for 40 years, but here we are.
Yeah, no, I know. I think, yeah, because we definitely saw the news this year, and that did get a lot of news. The handful of cases that were in the U.S. Was end of last summer, I believe it was. So then, I guess, how
Right.
would you, if someone's going somewhere where there is malaria, or I guess other like mosquito-borne disease or malaria specifically, what would you recommend they do if they're going? Do they get the pills? They get, obviously, they can have the other insect protection, but what do you even do when you're going off to places where malaria can really make you sick?
Yeah, I think having an appointment, whether it be a specific travel clinic or your primary care doctor, well in advance of your trip. Some of the medications that you need to take to prevent malaria need to be started well in advance of your trip. So, certainly getting in to see someone, there's a really good CDC website that can kind of tell you what you might want to talk about. Picking a prophylactic drug, and there's different options for different situations. And certainly, things like pregnancy or if you're on other drugs can impact which medication you may or may not want to take, but certainly taking something. And then when it comes to the actual travel piece and when you're in the country, assuming you're in an endemic area, the risk is relatively low if you're staying in an air conditioned hotel where the windows don't open, right? Because most of the biting happens in the evening hours when, in theory, you're going to be inside your hotel room and the air conditioning's on. But if that's not the type of setting where you're going to be, then there's a lot of value in repellents, and whether that be a mosquito topical repellent that you put on your skin or something like insect shield or another treatment of the clothing, be it a spray or whether it's impregnated into the clothing that has both sort of the insecticidal and a repellent component to it. And things like that may be increasingly important as the mosquitoes alter their feeding behaviors such that it's not just purely in the middle of the night. And those also have the added benefit of protecting you against other mosquito-borne diseases that are transmitted by other types of mosquitoes that are more common during the day and early evening. So not a lot of harm in being overly cautious. Certainly, as I mentioned, those of us who don't have any immunity, malaria can be a real emergency if you do get it.
Great. No, I think no, that's wonderful. I do actually have one more question about is it just that mosquito is just a nighttime or has typically been like kind of hangs like awake in the night, or is there a reason why it's a nighttime and other ones are daytime? It's just different types of mosquitoes have different times of day they like to be active.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't go into the evolutionary side of things of why, but certainly the main malaria mosquitoes, the Anopheles mosquitoes, tend to rest inside in a home or a shady area during the day, during the heat of the day. And then they tend to seek their meals in the cooler hours, ideally at night, which makes a lot of sense because the human is sleeping and in the absence of a net is vulnerable. Other mosquitoes, like those that transmit, be it West Nile or dengue or Zika, tend to rest more in the outside shaded part of the house under a eave or something like that, but then tend to bite in the cool hours of the morning and early evening. And why they have those different behaviors, I don't exactly know, but certainly there's different risks for different types of mosquitoes at different times of the day. And certainly having some sense of what's out there, but helps. But if you're not an entomologist, like I'm not an entomologist, it doesn't hurt to be covered and protected all times of the day.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your information with us, and we wish you the best of luck with your studies, and look forward to hearing how they go, and hope they can help change the world and help reduce malaria. Because I know for just decades or centuries, it's been a blight on populations and on people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.